to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm starting a vlog for a book that is going to take me most of the month to read, but I really wanted to document my progress through this book because it is probably my very most anticipated read of the year. In case you haven't heard me talk about it and you don't know already, that book is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte was my favorite fictional read of last year, and I actually had The Tenant of Wildfell Hall on my radar long before I read Agnes Grey, but it just so happened that was what we ended up reading in my Patreon for Victober last year, so it was kind of perfect. You may be wondering why I didn't read this during Victober, since it's perfectly Victorian literature, but I tend to be kind of slumpy in November because I'm coming off the high of all the good books in Victober and kind of burnt out from reading a ton in Victober, and so I wanted to schedule this book in November because I knew that it would make me really excited to read. So I am buddy reading this with Charlene and Beth, and I'm really excited about that as well. I think I'm reading it with my sister, also my older sister, so I'll probably be texting her and talking to her about it as well. I started it this morning. It's November 1st and I'm reading like 2 chapters a day, so it is going to take me most of the month to get through this book, but I'm really liking it so far. People had told me that they were unsure whether or not I would struggle with the epistolary format because I don't like epistolary novels. There are exceptions to that, and I will say already that this is one of them because it is written in letters, but it's someone's account that he's sending to someone else, at least so far. So far there are no letters back and forth. He's just sending this story of what happened to him and what happened in the area where he lives to someone else who we've not yet met. I don't know if he's going to factor into the story at any point. I have no idea. But because it's like that, it just reads like a first person account. It doesn't read like letters back and forth, because I think that's where I tend to kind of fall off with epistolary novels, is that it's people talking back and forth to each other, and I feel like disconnected because we're only knowing what they want the other person to know, so we might not know a lot of things. So I usually have a hard time just connecting with the characters when it's epistolary novels, although I've read some that I've enjoyed, and I even have some that I've given 5 stars to, so obviously this is not a hard and fast rule, but I was just a little bit nervous when I realized this was an epistolary novel, but my mind is already at ease 2 chapters in. I'm really enjoying it. We are from the perspective of a man who lives in this village, and so far we've already met his sister and his brother and his mom, and they're all quite funny characters. Well, especially his brother is really a funny character. And there is a vicar there, and he kind of has a thing for the vicar's younger daughter, so we've met the vicar's 2 daughters as well, and the vicar himself is hilarious. He's kind of like the opposite of Mr. Woodhouse in that he has all these things and ways that he eats, and he wants everyone to eat like him, which is actually the same as Mr. Woodhouse, except Mr. Woodhouse in Emma is a hypochondriac, and so he's like, you have to have the gruel, that's the only thing that will help you, and all these things. And in his case, he's like, you should eat raw eggs, and you should eat this, and you should eat this, because look at me, I'm a fine specimen of health, so obviously you should eat the same way as me. It just has a lot of those fun dynamics of a small town, and I'm really enjoying that. So the premise of the story so far is that there is a woman who has moved to Wildfell Hall, which has been abandoned for quite some time. The family no longer lives there, and so they finally have it let out to someone else. And this woman is a widow and has a young son, and everyone's talking about her because they don't know where she came from. They don't know anything about her, and she's really cold and standoffish, which is definitely not impressing everyone. I'll just put it that way. They don't have high opinions of her so far because she's just like very much keeps to herself. So that's kind of where we are right now. But I really like it so far. I found it kind of humorous, kind of the workings of a small town where everyone's gossiping. It rings really true for small towns that I have lived in. But I have one quote I want to share with you already because I feel like it's so valid. So the main character, is his name Gilbert? It is, Gilbert Markham. So he's visiting the vicar's daughters because, like I said, he has a thing for the younger daughter, and then there's an older daughter, and she's sitting there knitting, and the ball of yarn falls off her lap, and he picks it up for her, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Markham. I would have picked it up myself, only I did not want to disturb the cat," because she has a cat on her lap. And I was like, totally valid. You like when the cat is on you and you are the chosen one, you do not move in such a way that makes them leave. So anyways, this is just an introduction to this vlog. I can't wait to talk to you about this more as we get more and more into it, but I'm hoping that it's going to be a 5-star and a new favorite. Hello friends, it is time for a little update on The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and I am now, let's see how far I am. I am about 110 pages in, so I think that's probably close to a quarter of the way, maybe 20% of the way through, because there's notes and stuff in the back. So I just wanted to let you know what I was thinking and how the book is going so far. I'm loving it so far, which is really not surprising. Reading 2 chapters a day, and I don't usually want to stop after those 2 chapters. It's very immersive. So I think I said last time that this is written in a letter form from Gilbert to one of his friends, and there's this lady who has moved to the area and is now a tenant of this hall, and the gossip and stuff that's surrounding it. So Gilbert kind of has a thing for the vicar's younger daughter because he just finds her charming, and he's actually really fallen head over heels in love with Mrs. Graham, who is the lady who has moved to this hall that they're all talking about her. And he gets to know her son, who is about like 5 years old, and it's just kind of fun to see like the son and how he interacts with things, and like he really becomes friends with Gilbert because Gilbert has a dog and he really likes his dog, and one point Gilbert brings him one of the dog's puppies and stuff, and it's just like there's a lot of kind of sweetness about like the childhood of Arthur. It's really interesting to see Gilbert's change as he was really interested in this vicar's daughter because she was charming and kind of like the only girl around, and the relationship that he has with Mrs. Graham, she's much more cold to him, and you know that there's like a secret in her past, but you don't know what, like you don't know exactly what's going on. At the point in the story, they're kind of circulating rumors thinking that like the person that she's renting the hall from, that she actually is either secretly still married to him or that she was never married to him, and that she just had this child and she's staying here secretly. But yeah, so that's kind of like what people are speculating on at the time in this story. But it's really interesting because the relationship that Gilbert has with Mrs. Graham is one that is much more intellectual. Mrs. Graham is an amazing artist and she sells her paintings, and that's how she is providing for her family. And it is just absolutely amazing to see her paint too, because there's a point where they go on this like picnic to the ocean, and she goes and she paints, and like the description of the waves and the sea is just absolutely beautiful. So there's some gorgeous nature writing in here. But because Mrs. Graham loves to read, she loves to draw, and she has a very artistic and intellectual mind, it's really interesting to see the response that Gilbert has towards her is not just because she's beautiful, although she is, and it's not because she's charming like the vicar's daughter, it's because he engages deeply with her mind in addition to finding her beautiful. And I find that to be like really interesting to explore that here. It's just been a really interesting story so far. I personally think my theory in the story right now is that I think that Mrs. Graham has either fled from or had a husband who died from alcoholism, because there is a chapter towards the beginning of the book, I think it's like chapter 4 or something, where she goes to this dinner party at Gilbert's mother's house, and Gilbert's mother is trying to offer her some wine, and not only does she refuse, but her little son refuses and even shies away from it and hides his face, which makes me think that he has encountered alcoholism, because most children, even if they think that they shouldn't drink this or whatever, they're not going to have this fearful reaction unless they have like actually experience something very negative with it. Lisa, so that's my supposition at this time. But they have a really interesting conversation where she talks about wanting to shield him from vice and from temptation, and everyone else is like, oh, you're just gonna raise this like milksop of a man if you do that. And I disagree with that. I see her perspective in wanting to protect him, but Gilbert brings up a really interesting point to her where he talks about how we shouldn't just raise our children to try to keep their paths as smooth as possible to keep them from temptation, but what we need to do is raise them with good enough character so that way they can be fortified against temptation. And I thought that that was a really interesting thing, because as a parent, that's something that like you want your child to make the right choices in life and not something that's going to be damaging or detrimental to them or immoral. And so I can totally relate to wanting to protect and shield my child from the difficulties of the world or from things that will be negative influences. But in the same respect, home is a safe place to fall, so to speak, where they can encounter temptations on a smaller scale than they will in the real world, and prepare them to say no to temptation and prepare them to see what the consequences of giving into temptation are on like a lower scale, where if they were to give into this temptation as an adult with more adult things, they would find themselves evicted or find themselves fired from a job. But they can learn the responsibility and the character at home in small things and fail in small things to then hopefully learn from those things and not have to learn those lessons with really big and difficult things. And so I get both sides of the picture, and I think both sides are important. You know, I think that as parents, we are called to like shield our children from evil to an extent, but I also think that we're called to teach them how to overcome stumbling blocks. And I think that oftentimes the way that you learn to overcome vice and temptation and those kinds of things is through experience. So I see both sides of this, and I just thought it was a really interesting conversation. It's been one of my favorite parts of the book so far. Anyways, that's my little update for now. I will come back and let you know more. So far, I don't think anything that I have shared is spoilery. I might share spoilery things as I progress, especially as we get more into themes and we learn more about like who Mrs. Graham really is and what's going on with her, because I do think her past is going to be a really interesting component of this story, because right now it's all speculation and no one knows exactly what is going on with her. So I'm really curious to see where that part of the story is going to lead us. Hey guys, it is time for a little update on Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I am now close to the halfway point. I actually don't have my book in here. I'm just in here because I'm recording some other videos, so I'm like, now is a good time to do a little blurb about this. So I feel like this section could be like mildly spoilery, but maybe not. And the reason why I say that is because I don't know what's happening in this portion of the book, because I didn't read anything about the book before I read it. But one of the people that I'm reading it with read the back of her book, and she had some more information. So I don't think she's as surprised by some of the things that are happening as I am. Surprised might not be the right word. So anyways, last left you, I was talking about how Gilbert is like really into Mrs. Graham. Helen is her first name, and he just like really likes her. And so he kind of catches her in this position that looks compromising, like that she is with someone else. And so he gets mad at her and like refuses to speak to her and all these things. And she's, in order to prove to him kind of like that he thinks wrongly about her, she's like, because she actually cares about him in return, she hands him her diary. So the rest of the book so far, from where I am, is her diary entries. And so we kind of start at the beginning of her coming to this place, staying with her aunt and uncle, and I guess they're the ones that are currently raising her, and her interactions with a young man named Mr. Huntingdon. And Mr. Huntingdon is like very charismatic and very handsome, and her aunt and uncle have some plans of who they want her to marry. Her aunt has someone in mind and her uncle has someone else in mind. The uncle wants her to go for this really old rich guy, and the aunt wants her to go for this other guy who's also wealthy but also like very pious and very moral. So both the aunt and the uncle have like different priorities of what they think she should be looking for. Meanwhile, Helen just like wants to do her own thing. She doesn't like either of these guys. She's repelled by both of them. And she meets Mr. Huntingdon at a ball, and he like whisks her away from one of these old men, and he's like super flirtatious, and like she can't stop thinking about him. She's head over heels in love with him. And the story just kind of is going from there, and it is just like, man, Mr. Huntingdon is a walking red flag, honestly. Like, he is so manipulative, and he comes in and he like gaslights her in like the most classic, typical, like stereotypical, like textbook definition of gaslighting is what Mr. Huntingdon does. I think a lot of people will like use that phrase jokingly and be like, oh, he's a narcissist, he gaslights. Like, Mr. Huntingdon like really does. It is crazy the way that he behaves towards her, and she's able to recognize some of these flaws, but she's so attracted to him that she can't help it. But he is continually like pushing her outside of societal conventions. Like, before they have even really had much of conversations, he's trying to extract a declaration of love from her at a public place. There's not other people standing right there listening to this conversation, but anyone could walk in at any point, and he's got like his arm around her waist and like he kisses her against her will. There's a part of her that's like infuriated and feels violated, but there's also a part of her that likes it because she's super attracted to him and she really does like him. And so he's doing all of these things, and like he finds out that she's drawn some portraits of him, and he teases her about it, and like does all the like takes the paintings from her. And then when she doesn't behave the way that he wants her to, and it doesn't elicit the kind of like reaction, like she's just like very cold about it and is like, I give him a reaction, that's what he wants. So she gives him no reaction, and he gets so upset that he doesn't get the reaction that he wants that he completely ignores her and starts flirting with this other girl that's present. And it is like so, like, he is so infuriating the way that he like tries to control her. At the point of the story where I am, they are married, and so she did not listen to the warnings of other people because her aunt tried to warn her and she wasn't listening. And she had this belief of like, well, I can change him. He's very like flippant of religion or very dismissive, and she's like, I can change him, and I can do this, and I can make him a better man, and all these kinds of things. There's all these rumors of like what he was like before he was with Helen, and the servants start to like leak things out, and she's like, no, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear what he was like before. I don't want to. And so we don't actually really know what he was like before. I kind of get an impression that he was kind of partying, womanizer, because that's kind of how he still behaves a little bit. But she just like, she believes that she can change him. And it's like, it's so infuriating. I wasn't expecting this book to make me so angry, but I'm like so mad. Like, I want to punch this guy and rescue Helen from this situation, even though now it's like too late because they're married. So I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know if she's gonna like leave him, because in the book she's going as Helen Graham, that's her name, Mrs. Graham, and says that she's a widow, but her name is Helen Huntingdon. She's married now. So I don't think she like marries someone else after him. I think that she has like gone somewhere and like changed her name for whatever reason. So I don't know if it's because she like left him and doesn't want him to find her, or if like he died and she just wants a fresh start, so she just changed her name. I don't know where we're going with this, but it's horrific knowing the way that women were treated in the Victorian time period in terms of marriage and in terms of the rights and things that they had as wives, that the husband would own all the property and they had no control, and if they decided to leave, the husband had the right to keep the children and not let mothers ever see their children and all of those kinds of things. And that's why I'm kind of like, okay, well, if she wanted to leave him because it's a dangerous situation, but she wanted to bring her son with her, she would have to be in hiding. Otherwise, legally, he would be able to come take the child away from her. And seeing how manipulative and horrible he is, he would do that. He would try to manipulate her and try to get her back by holding her son above her head and basically mistreating the son so she would come back to make sure the son is not being harmed by the father. Like, he would do that, I think. Anyways, that's where I am in the story. I still love it. Like, it is like a page turner for me. Not in that it's like, it's not like a thriller or something like that, but like the pages fly by. And like I said earlier, like I don't really want to stop after 2 chapters, but I've been extremely busy. So 2 chapters a day was a very wise choice that is sustainable for me. But yeah, I will come back and update you again at least one more time at the end, but maybe another time in between if something happens that I just like have to talk about. But I'm still really enjoying it, even though it's making me really mad. Hello, it is time for a final update on my thoughts on Tenet of Wellfell Hall. So when last we chatted, I think it was about halfway through the book. There were not updates really in the second half of the book, so I'm gonna kind of give you a little bit of update on that. That will be spoilery, but it'll be marked so you can skip over that to my final thoughts if you don't want to be spoiled. So I was saying before that Mr. Huntingdon is just a despicable human being, and my gosh, he made me so angry. But like, he was just getting started, honestly, because of the part of the book where I left off, there were a lot of things that had not yet happened. Like, Arthur had not yet been born, but my word, I was not expecting that this small little child would be so horrifically treated by his father. You know, I would have thought he would have just either entirely ignored him or been just as manipulative to him as he was to Helen. But what he did instead was to take this little child on his knee when he's binge drinking with his friends and telling like horrible jokes and saying all kinds of bad words and teaching his child to say these things, teaching his child like to get drunk at like 3, 4, 5 years old, and like just so horrific. The things that he was doing as a parent seemed even worse than what he was doing as a husband. And I think that part of the reason he did it was because he just thought it was funny to see this little innocent child drinking and getting drunk and swearing, and he'd teach him to say horrible things about his mother. But like, Arthur didn't know what he was saying. He didn't know what it meant. He was just repeating what his father told him to say, because then his father would laugh and approve of him, and he didn't even know that what he was doing was wrong or wicked or any of those things. And I think part of it, again, was like for the kicks because he found it amusing, but part of it was also because it was another way for him to hurt Helen. She's already told him, you know, I have absolutely no respect for you anymore. And then she catches him in an affair, and she's like, from this point on, we're like married in name only. Like, I don't love you anymore, and there's nothing you could do to make me love you again. And so eventually she ends up leaving, which is what, you know, I suspected and what probably every synopsis of this book says. But what really struck me about her leaving is her servant Rachel, who is older, and she's like, I should leave you here because, you know, you'll get in even more trouble if we get found out in this, and I don't want you to have to start all over. Like, I want you to be able to retire somewhere and like not have to do all this work. And she's like, I would never leave you. And like, Rachel is just like such a wonderful person, and it really goes to show like why she treated Gilbert the way that she did, because she was really cold toward Gilbert, and I think it's just that she was super protective of Helen. Anyway, so once Gilbert gets to the end of Helen's diary, then we pick back up in his letter that he's written to his friend about how like he's so devastated because now he knows that he's wronged Helen and wronged Mr. Lawrence by accusing him of like, you know, being with Helen inappropriately, and he actually ends up like punching Mr. Lawrence when he thinks that it's like Helen's like secret lover or whatever, and then finds out Mr. Lawrence is actually her brother who helped her escape, which was my suspicion all along, was that it was actually her brother and it wasn't, you know, something inappropriate. But Mr. Lawrence forgives Gilbert so quickly, because when Gilbert goes to him and is like, she gave me her diary and now I know that you're just her brother trying to help her and I shouldn't have punched you. And Mr. Lawrence is like, well, I feel so much better. You completely put my mind at ease. I'm like, this guy punched you and knocked you off your horse because he thought you were doing something you weren't, and you were just like, well, I feel great about this now. Like, I would have been like, why did you believe the worst of me? Why didn't you ask me? Why did you not even try to talk to me about this? Your response was just to punch me in the head and knock me off my horse. Anyways, all that to say that then Helen finds out that her actual, you know, lawful husband is ill and possibly dying, and so she goes back to take care of him because, surprise, surprise, all of his friends and lovers have deserted him because he's a terrible person and they don't want to be around him, and no one's there to take care of him because they were only around like for the good times, you know. And so I just like the way that Helen reacts when she goes back to him. You know, there's this part of you that's like, okay, is this a trap? Is he just trying to get her back? But it's not a trap, and she's just like so kind to him despite all the things that he's done to her, because she wants him to find peace and to find Christ before he dies. And so she's doing all this like essentially for the benefit of his soul, while he's berating her and saying, you're just doing this to prove that you're more righteous than me, which is absolutely not the case. And just like, gosh, what a saint Helen is. Like, truly, she is so wonderful. And as a result, I felt a little bit lackluster about the end of this book, that Gilbert does end up with her. I mean, I realize that that's like a happy ending for Helen. I understand that, and she deserves a happy ending, like for real. She really does. But I was like, he's not good enough for her. Like, she's so wonderful. And his response when he thinks she's doing something she shouldn't be doing is to go punch a guy's lights out and believe the worst of both of them, instead of actually trying to have a conversation with her. Even though everyone else was saying all these horrible rumors about her, he didn't believe them. But then when he saw something that implied something, he instantly just believed all the rumors then, instead of actually trying to talk to her about anything. And so it was just like, I don't know. And I just felt like Gilbert kind of like flies off the handle, and I don't know, like, I didn't feel like he was good enough for Helen, honestly, although he was far better than the alternative of Mr. Huntingdon. But I don't know, I just didn't feel like as invested in the romantic aspect, which is very different from Agnes Grey. Like, I loved the romantic protagonist in Agnes Grey, and even though Agnes Grey is a much quieter story, I loved the romance, and it was one that I felt like the two of them were perfect together and perfectly deserved each other, and I felt like they weren't quite matched in this respect. So I think that made it just a little bit less satisfying for me at the end. Okay, so here are my final thoughts that are not spoilery at all, if you want to know. I really enjoyed this book. Like, it felt so fast-paced because there was so much drama and so much happening. And in that respect, it felt so different from Agnes Grey. And I can see why people who read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall first might be disappointed with Agnes Grey, because it's a much quieter book. It feels more like, I don't know, there is some drama because some of the people that Agnes is a governess for are like terrible people. So there's drama in that, but overall it's just a much more quiet book, and it's shorter, so you kind of have less expounding upon people's character and things that happen. So The Tenant of Wildfell Hall feels a lot more fast-paced and a lot more like you're turning the page like, oh my gosh, like what is gonna happen? How is this gonna resolve? And I think that was really like very enjoyable. The writing was really enjoyable. I loved Helen / Mrs. Graham, depending on which part of the book you're reading. I loved her as a character. I thought that she was just such a wonderful example of someone who was so Christ-like. Even in the face of abuse, she was so kind, and so, I don't know, she was just like such a wonderful person, and she was so easy to root for. I think that this book is also like a really good example of like, be careful who you're married to. Like, maybe do listen to the people around you who are advising you about your relationships, particularly people who are older and wiser than you, because Helen could have saved herself a lot of heartache if she had listened to the people around her who were telling her, and she had evidence of many of those things firsthand before she ever married this person. I loved a lot of things about this book. It is funny though, because I didn't feel like it was very much epistolary, even though it is technically written in letters, and then we have a chunk of Helen's journal, but it doesn't feel like letters because they're like conversations that are exactly recounted word for word and different things like that. And like it only says at the beginning of like some chapters, like, oh, I'm writing to you again about this. Like there are chapters and chapters and chapters that are like one letter, and so it doesn't feel very epistolary. So if you're someone like me where you're like, oh, it's epistolary and I don't know how I feel about epistolary novels, this doesn't feel epistolary at all. It just feels like a first person account from Gilbert's perspective, and then once we get Helen's journal, then it feels like a first person account of what happened to her, and so it doesn't feel like it's written in letters at all. So that was not at all a deterrent for me. That might not matter to you anyway, because I definitely feel like I'm very much in the minority of being someone who doesn't really enjoy epistolary novels. I feel like most people do, so that's kind of like a nitpicky thing on my part. So the question is, did I love this book as much as Agnes Grey? Is it a new favorite? Is it a best book of the year? The answer to all of those questions is no. But I really loved it. It's like a very solid book for me, but I actually did like Agnes Grey more. I mentioned why, I think, in the spoilery section of this final update here. But essentially, I just felt like I could kind of like root for some of the things in the story a bit more in Agnes Grey, and I found those same elements in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be a little bit less satisfying. And I still really loved it. I still feel like it was really well written, and it was so infuriating, which I was absolutely not expecting this book to make me as angry as it did, and I can't remember the last time I read a book that made me this angry. So for a book to move me and make me feel so deeply is like very, very high marks. Is it my favorite book of the year? Time will tell. Maybe I need to let it percolate a little bit more, but it doesn't feel like it's quite at that 5-star mark, but it feels really, really close. Like it feels like it's a solid 4 for sure. Maybe it's a 4.5. Is it a favorite of the year? Like absolute favorite? I feel like probably not. Either way, I am so glad I read this book, and so glad I read it in November, in a month where I'm normally slumpy. I was reading something that I loved and didn't want to put down, and so it was just really a wonderful experience to read this, and I do highly recommend it, but just know going in that there are going to be moments where you want to strangle some people. I was reading Kristen Lavrenstatter with my friend Dia at the same time, and she uses this term, and I love it. If you've read with Dia or you've heard Dia talk about unlikable characters in books, you've probably heard her refer to people as sharp corner people, and those are people that you hope that they will walk into sharp corners because they deserve it. And so when I was reading Kristen Lavrenstatter with Dia, she was calling one of the characters in there a sharp corner person, and I'm like, yeah, he's not great, but in comparison with the person I'm reading about in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, the person you're talking about feels like an absolute angel. I don't know if I've ever read such a despicable character in my life, but it was still so good, and like really highlighted the struggles of women in Victorian times in terms of marriage, which I already talked about in one of my previous updates, that, you know, you didn't have rights to just walk away. Like men could walk away and women could not. And so I feel like this was a really good illustration of those things. So I really liked it a lot. If you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did. I've heard a lot of people give this 5 stars. So for me to not give it quite 5 stars probably seems almost harsh compared to other people's thoughts on it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.